1,440 minutes in a day. And a third of that time is dedicated to speaking a language that was never meant for my type of articulation. A language that my lips can never stretch themselves far enough around to accommodate quite correctly. Evidently, my tongue is just too stubborn. It is all brass knuckle and bodega coffee sips slipping in between my lips. It's the disobedient child. Set in the ways of the only world it knows, it throws words of the West against the coast of the East. My tongue is a loaded gun. Each bullet an accent decorated with the remnants of places my ancestors have once been. It is equipped to hit each target with the intent to elicit images of islands far from here, islands my voice won't let disappear. My tongue is multifaceted. It is the key with which I open doors that were never meant for me and mine to enter, because I speak of Callaloo and Canarsie, of Crown Heights and Cocoa Bread, of Carnival and Calypso and Coney and Church Ave, because the English I speak hit different. See, it got too much hip, too much hop, too much soca, reggae, and dancehall. It got too much flossy, too much spice, not from the food that I eat, but from the words that I speak. My tongue is way too advanced for any type of standard English. So in the poem I just spit, I gave y'all a little taste of a commonly used linguistic phenomenon known as code switching. And if you don't know what that is, don't worry, we're gonna get into it. But first, let's start off with a question. So by a show of hands, how many of your parents and or guardians have ever talked or acted one way around you and then a completely different way around your friends? Show of hands. I've experienced this all the time. It was very common for my parents. Both of my parents are from the West Indies, my mother being from Trinidad and Tobago, and my father being from St. Lucia. So whenever my mother was upset with me or she was yelling, she would say something along the lines of, whole day all you sitting here and nobody wash the dishes? All you feel like is the maid over. And then, when my friends would come around, it would be a completely different story. It would sound something like, Jaellin, my darling daughter Jaellin, whenever you get the chance, please bless the kitchen with your presence and wash the dishes. Now, I'm exaggerating, but in those moments, the Americanized version of my mother came out. So she dropped the accent, she slowed down, and her tone changed to light and airy. And if I didn't know any better, I would have thought that she was a completely different person had I not seen her face. But she wasn't the only one to do this. My father did it as well. Now his accent is a little stronger, so it never fully disappeared, but whenever he was on the phone with, let's say, one of my teachers at school, it would sound something like, good afternoon, Miss Bear. This is John King, Jaellin King's father, and I was just calling in regards to her school trip this Friday. A little British thing going on, but that's neither here nor there. But then when he was on the phone with his brothers, people down the block around the corner across the street could hear him. Very loud man. Hey, yo, big man, what going on? I haven't heard you in a minute. And I understand that his brothers and my professors were completely different people, but it still didn't sit right with me. It rubbed me the wrong way. Why? Well, because I loved, and I still love my parents' accents, and I just couldn't understand why they didn't let other people experience it like I did. But the real eye-opening moment for me was my freshman year at Towson about 3 years ago. Class had just ended. I was walking outside with a group of people, and my friend from New York had called to check in on me. So of course, I answered in true New York fashion. Yeah, what's goody? And the rest of the conversation kind of flowed like that. And when I hung up, I looked up and I looked at my classmates, and everybody was watching me like I had morphed into a different person. But it was that moment that I realized that unconsciously, I had been doing what my parents had did for years. And the question I always asked myself was, why? Why do I speak differently around different groups of people? Why couldn't I just pick one way to speak and use that in all my conversations? Now, these questions, they sparked my interest because I knew the concept, but I didn't understand the vocabulary around it. So after doing some research, I found that we were all code switching. And a lot of people do it. But I code switched because I was scared. Scared because people create boxes that they expected me to fit in. But that just never worked. We are all unique individuals with a variety of backgrounds, cultures, identities. And I always use code switching as a way to suppress my identities when, in fact, I should have been using it to celebrate them. So today, I want to define code switching, then explain why we code switch, and go over how we can use code switching to create opportunities that benefit us. So first question, what is code switching? Well, I already gave you a couple of examples in my introduction, but I wanted to give a concrete definition. So according to Oxford Dictionary, code switching is defined as the practice of alternating between two or more languages or varieties of language in conversation. Usually when people are referring to code switching, they're talking about two languages such as English and Spanish. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we're going to talk about dialects and accents. So there are two different varieties that you should know in languages. There's high variety and low variety. High variety of languages is usually the socially acceptable, sophisticated, buttoned up standard English. You'd use high variety in interviews, sermons in church, maybe, let's say, when you're sending emails to your professors or your bosses. You would code switch into more professional jargon because that's the most socially acceptable example in those cases. Low variety consists of regional dialects, which includes slang, Ebonics, African American vernacular English, or anything that is not considered standard. And you'd usually use this when you're texting or talking to one of your friends or your family members. So an example of somebody using this is our former 44th president, Barack Obama. He did this a lot in his political speeches. He always had to use the high variety language because it was a political speech, sophisticated language. But usually, when he was comfortable enough, he would let his guard down and he would switch into low variety. So a perfect example I'm thinking of right now is Barack Obama in Jamaica. He went to give a speech at the town hall and he was greeting them. And before he started his high variety language, he greeted them and said, "Wagwan Jamaica." And that is patois, and he used their dialect because it made them more comfortable. He practiced the first rule of public speaking, which is knowing your audience. And essentially, we do that every time we code switch. We exercise public speaking just on a smaller scale. And when we code switch, we move back and forth between high and low varieties of language. But why do we do that? Why do we code switch? So many people have different reasons that we code switch. We just code switch to discuss certain topics. We code switch to impress or persuade certain people. We code switch to participate in social activities. But the common thread between all of these is the fact that people don't want to be the odd one out. People want to be included. People tend to assimilate to the environment that they're in so they don't feel like they're other. So let's take it back to the low and high varieties of language. You would never use low variety language or slang in a high variety situation or a professional setting. I would not use my New York accent, my New York slang in an interview for a job unless it was called for. There's a universally known saying, and it goes, "When in Rome, do as the Romans do." In a different situation or setting, others will try to conform to the norms of that situation to avoid being the outsider. Just like children, the way they say, watch what you say around your children, they copy, they emulate exactly what you do. So have to be wise, be careful what you say. And the same way when you're in a relationship or you've been friends with somebody for a long time, it's so easy to pick up on their code. And then once you do that, you guys become comfortable with one another. Very common. And essentially, people are scared to be judged because others will measure your intelligence based on the way you speak. It's natural to do this. They ask themselves, does this person have the ability or the knowledge to participate in this conversation, to understand these social contexts? And that's because we are conditioned and raised to believe that there's only one type of standard English. Society will try to convince you that there are other types of one type of standard English to wield power over those who do not speak like the majority, which is the problem for the majority of Black people, Caribbean people, African people. We face this every day. We struggle to express ourselves in a world that don't understand our differences, our languages, our dialects. So knowing that, the question now becomes, how do we navigate this space? How can we use code switching to help us rather than set us back? Well, the first thing I can think of is networking. Once you code switch and disclose your personal identity to others, you gain the opportunity to form bonds with people who identify as you do. So I'm thinking of an example. When I came to Towson 3 years ago, I didn't know anybody. I was alone, I didn't come with anybody from high school, and one day I went to the BSU office. I met a girl, and usually when people meet me here, the first thing they ask me is, "Hey, are you from New York?" Because sometimes the accent slips out. And I said yes, and instantly she connected me with a whole bunch of her friends that were from New York, from Brooklyn, from the Bronx. And from those friends, I were able to meet people who had Caribbean backgrounds, whose parents were from Jamaica, Guyana, all these other places. And it was because of that moment of me just code switching, being authentic to myself, I created the opportunity to be natural in that space. Another way code switching can be used to benefit us is within the classroom. It can help aid and accelerate your learning. So math, let's take math for example. Math has its own set of vocabulary words associated with it. But if a teacher or a tutor learns the code that resonates with their classmates, their students, the concepts can reach their students more effectively. So this can even work in conversation with your friends, trying to get them to understand what you're saying. You have to meet them where they are. Explain things to them in their code, and the information will be received easier. So I'm thinking about how I grew up, and my father did this all the time with me. When I was in school, most subjects he tutored me in, but the worst subject was history. Social studies was the bane of my existence. I couldn't stand it. It just seemed very boring. But my dad took something that was boring and he turned it into a drama. So he took my favorite TV shows, my favorite movies, my favorite books, and explained the complex events that took place way back when into things that I understood. If teachers could be as culturally competent or familiar and aware of the diversity in their classroom, more students will benefit from this. Another opportunity I can think about is opening the door for making more connections. Way back when, maybe say like 2 years ago, I worked at IHOP. And there was a lady that was being very belligerent. She was very belligerent. And I guess her waitress just didn't understand her order. She wasn't getting anything. And she called the manager. She said, I need somebody else. I don't want this person taking my order anymore. Just get me a new person. So of course, I was that lucky person. And I went up to her, code switched again into the standard English, because I didn't know who she was. And I said, hello, my name is Jaellin. How can I take your order? And she started speaking, and I heard the Trini accent. I didn't really acknowledge it. I didn't really say anything to her, but I instantly switched because I became comfortable. So I started talking in my Trinidadian accent. And she called it out, and she said, oh my goodness, is your family from Trinidad? Oh my God, where are you guys from? I'm from Puerto Spain, oh my goodness. And we just had this dialogue, this open dialogue, this conversation. But I realized in that moment that she didn't switch to the standard English so that the other waitress could understand her. And what that did was open the opportunity for that girl to learn other cultures. Had that lady switched to the standard English, we would never know about Trinidadian culture. We'd never know about Caribbean culture. We'd never know how to engage with others who are different from us. So that was a big opportunity, and I really respected her in that moment, and I try to live my life like that from now on. These opportunities will only come to fruition if we ourselves start to view code switching as an avenue for learning. Code switching is a phenomenon that gives individuals advantages within everyday communication. So when you become attuned to code switching, you start to see it and hear it everywhere because our accents, our backgrounds, our identities are rooted in language. So don't code switch to hide your identities, code switch to celebrate them. Like several other aspects of culture, such as hair, music, skin color, code switching should be embraced. So talk the way you talk. Code switch if you aren't being understood, but don't make yourself smaller to make others feel bigger. Don't let code switching be your kryptonite. Let it be your superpower. Thank you.
Great job.